In early 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast battlefield, stretching from the coast of California to the jungles of Burma. Only 6 months earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had stunned the United States and left the U.S. Pacific Fleet badly crippled. Battleships lay on the harbor floor, and much of the American public feared that Japan's navy could now strike anywhere it pleased. Yet amid the destruction, one group of vessels survived: the aircraft carriers. On that fact alone would rest the fate of the Pacific. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, three American carriers, had been out at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack. Their survival meant that the U.S. Navy still possessed the tools to strike back. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was at its peak. In a mere 6 months, its forces had captured Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Philippines. Japan's admirals believed they could now force a decisive battle that would permanently shatter American naval power. The architect of this vision was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. Yamamoto was a realist. He understood that Japan's industrial base could not sustain a long war against the United States. His solution was to deliver a single, crushing blow that would force Washington to negotiate peace on Japan's terms. The place chosen for that blow was a small, lonely atoll in the Central Pacific, Midway. Located roughly halfway between Asia and North America, the atoll consisted of two main islands surrounded by coral reefs. To the Japanese, Midway was more than a speck of sand. It was a strategic outpost that could threaten Hawaii and serve as a staging area for further expansion. With that knowledge, Nimitz decided to gamble. He gathered every available carrier he had, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, and sent them to lie in wait northeast of Midway. The Americans would not be ambushed. Instead, they would ambush the ambushers. By late May, the stage was set. Two mighty carrier forces were converging on a tiny atoll, barely 2 miles wide. Between them stood the course of the Pacific War. As dawn broke on June 3, 1942, American patrol aircraft flying from Midway sighted the approaching Japanese invasion force. The battle that would decide the balance of power in the Pacific was about to begin. End of Part 1. Next, the first strikes and the cost of discovery. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the waters around Midway lay calm beneath a rising sun. At 4:30 a.m., crews aboard the four Japanese carriers began preparing their aircraft for the first wave of attacks. Admiral Nagumo's plan was straightforward: bomb Midway's airfield and installations to neutralize any American aircraft stationed there, then prepare for a second strike to destroy whatever remained. Once the island was secured, his surface fleet and transports would move in for the invasion. At exactly 4:30 a.m., engines roared to life. The decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu shook as 108 planes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, rose into the pale light and turned east toward the island. Their departure left the carriers temporarily vulnerable, their decks nearly empty and their hangars filled with fuel lines and munitions being readied for the next launch. Meanwhile, at Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming formation just after 5 a.m. Sirens sounded across the atoll as Marines and Navy personnel scrambled to their stations. Fighters of Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-221 lifted off the short coral-covered runway to intercept the attackers. They were outnumbered and flying older aircraft, Buffaloes and Wildcats, but they went anyway. Above the island, the battle turned fierce. Japanese Zeros cut through the American defenders with superior speed and climb, but several bombers were damaged or shot down before reaching their targets. At 6:20 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions ripped across Midway's airfield, hangars, and fuel tanks. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky. Yet despite the punishment, the island's defenders continued to fire back with anti-aircraft guns, and the damage, while severe, did not knock the base out of action. By 7 a.m., the Japanese strike force was turning home, unaware that the Americans already knew the location of their carriers. Admiral Nagumo now faced a dilemma. His returning pilots radioed that a second strike would be needed to finish off Midway's defenses. But almost simultaneously, scouts from his own fleet began reporting sightings of American ships to the northeast. The reports were incomplete, only fragments of information, but they hinted that enemy carriers might be present. Nagumo had two choices: launch a second attack on Midway as planned, or rearm his planes with anti-ship weapons to strike the newly found enemy fleet. He hesitated. Below decks, ordnance crews began switching out bombs for torpedoes, moving explosive loads back and forth across the hangar floors. It was a dangerous, time-consuming process. At 7:45 a.m., as this work continued, a single Japanese scout plane finally confirmed what Nagumo feared. The Americans had carriers nearby. He ordered the rearming halted, and the aircraft prepared for anti-ship operations. The decks and hangars of the four carriers were now a maze of fuel hoses, bombs, and half-loaded planes. A disaster waiting for a spark. While Nagumo struggled with his decision, Admiral Nimitz's own carriers had already launched. From hundreds of miles away, waves of aircraft from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were racing toward the Japanese position. They came in groups, launched at staggered times, navigating by dead reckoning across vast stretches of empty ocean. Many never found the enemy. Others ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. But their persistence kept the Japanese off balance, forcing Nagumo to maneuver defensively and delaying his counterstrike. By 9:20 a.m., the first American torpedo squadrons found the Japanese fleet. Flying low over the water, the TBD Devastator bombers from Hornet and Enterprise pressed home their attacks. The pilots knew their outdated planes were slow and poorly armored, but they charged in anyway. Zero fighters pounced, tearing into the formations. One by one, the Devastators were shot down, their torpedoes falling harmlessly into the sea. Of the 41 planes that attacked, only a handful returned. The attacks achieved no hits, but they accomplished something far more important. They dragged every Japanese fighter down to sea level. High above, unseen, another group was approaching, the dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. The stage was about to shift from confusion to catastrophe. The morning sun had climbed high above the Pacific when the Japanese fleet finally caught its breath. Vice Admiral Nagumo's four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, zigzagged across a patch of ocean littered with fuel slicks and smoke from downed aircraft. Their decks were crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. Crews worked furiously, sweating under the heat and urgency. At last, Nagumo had decided to launch his counterstrike against the American carriers reported to the northeast. He was minutes away from sending them aloft. Then the sky darkened. At 10:20 a.m., lookouts aboard Kaga spotted aircraft diving out of the sun. They were the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. By sheer chance and a little bit of luck, they had arrived at precisely the right moment. After failing to locate the Japanese for most of the morning, their leader, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had made a fateful decision to keep searching just a little longer. His gamble paid off when he sighted the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which was racing to rejoin the fleet after chasing an American submarine. McCluskey followed its trail straight to Nagumo's carriers. Below them, chaos reigned. Japanese fighters were still low over the water, having just repelled the torpedo attacks. The carriers' decks were stacked with fully fueled aircraft loaded with bombs and torpedoes. It was the most vulnerable moment imaginable. McCluskey's group split in two. One section went for Kaga, the other for Akagi. From high above, the Dauntlesses folded their dive brakes and plunged almost vertically. The sound of the dives, the high-pitched whistle of air screaming through the perforated brakes, was the sound of fate descending. At 10:22 a.m., the first bombs struck Kaga. One hit near the bridge, another amidships, and a third near the stern. Gasoline and ammunition ignited instantly. Within seconds, the ship became a roaring inferno. Only moments later, 3 bombs slammed into Akagi. One penetrated the hangar deck and detonated among armed planes. Flames raced through the interior, setting off secondary explosions. Admiral Nagumo barely escaped as his flagship burned from stem to stern. The carrier's steering failed. She drifted helplessly as her crew abandoned ship. At the same time, planes from Yorktown attacked Soryu. Their aim was deadly. 3 direct hits tore through her decks, engulfing the ship in fire. Within 10 minutes, 3/4 of the Japanese carrier force was finished. Aboard the remaining carrier, Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi took command. Amid the chaos, he retained remarkable composure. Rather than flee, he launched immediate retaliation. Around 10:45 a.m., Hiryu sent her first wave of dive bombers toward the position of the U.S. carriers. Guided by radio reports, they soon found Yorktown. At 12 p.m., the sky above Yorktown filled with black dots. The carrier's guns thundered as sailors manned their stations. Several Japanese bombers were shot down, but 3 250-kilogram bombs found their mark. One exploded on the flight deck, another penetrated the hangar, and a third detonated deep inside the ship. Fires erupted. The vessel slowed to a stop. For a moment, it appeared she might be lost. Yet her damage control teams worked miracles, bringing the flames under control and restoring power. Within an hour, Yorktown was making 20 knots again. The ship had survived, temporarily. Hiryu's second wave arrived just after 2 p.m., this time armed with torpedoes. Attacking from both sides, the Japanese pilots scored 2 solid hits. Yorktown shuddered under the impact. Her engines stalled, and she began to list. Smoke billowed from her sides. Admiral Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, transferred command to Enterprise. The crew was ordered to abandon ship, but the ship itself refused to sink immediately. She would drift for another day, a ghost on the water. Back at the Japanese fleet, Yamaguchi believed he had evened the odds, but American scouts had already located Hiryu. Before sunset, Enterprise and Hornet launched another wave of dauntless bombers. Guided by reports and the fading glow of burning ships on the horizon, they found their target at 5 p.m. Diving through anti-aircraft fire, they struck Hiryu with 4 direct hits. Explosions tore through her decks. Within hours, she too was ablaze. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon his ship. That night, as flames engulfed the bridge, he chose to go down with her. By the time darkness fell on June 4th, 1942, the Japanese had lost all 4 of their frontline carriers. In a single day, the backbone of the Imperial Navy's striking power had been broken. The Americans had lost Yorktown. She would finally sink 2 days later. But in exchange, they had eliminated the same force that had bombed Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier. The Battle of Midway had turned in less than 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes would change the Pacific forever. As night fell on June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was illuminated by fires that burned for miles. The sea itself seemed to glow, a grim reflection of the infernos consuming the shattered wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The once invincible strike force that had terrorized the Pacific was gone. Flames, smoke, and oil marked the graves of over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen. For the American crews aboard Enterprise and Hornet, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. Many of them had witnessed the impossible, the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. For months, they had lived with the shadow of Pearl Harbor, haunted by the thought that Japan could not be stopped. Now, for the first time, they believed victory was possible. The next morning, the calm returned, broken only by the crackle of radio messages and the distant sound of explosions as the crippled carriers finally slipped beneath the waves. Admiral Nimitz, receiving the news from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, understood its magnitude immediately. "This is the turning point," he wrote in his report. Yet he also knew the war was far from over. The Japanese still possessed a powerful fleet, battleships, cruisers, and dozens of smaller carriers. But from this moment, they would never again hold the strategic initiative. On June 5th, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft continued to shadow the retreating Japanese forces. Damaged cruisers and destroyers tried desperately to regroup and escape the area. American planes struck at them where possible, inflicting further damage, though the main enemy force managed to slip away. Meanwhile, crews aboard Yorktown and the accompanying destroyer Hammond attempted to save the stricken carrier. Salvage teams worked tirelessly, patching holes and pumping out water. Hope grew that she might be towed back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. But on June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, managed to penetrate the protective screen. It launched a spread of torpedoes that struck both Hammond and Yorktown. Hammond sank within minutes. Yorktown lingered a little longer before finally rolling onto her side and disappearing beneath the sea. For the Americans, it was a bitter loss, but it could not diminish the scale of their victory. In Japan, the news came as a shock that the government tried desperately to conceal. The military announced that minor losses had occurred near Midway, but rumors quickly spread through the ranks. Sailors and pilots waiting for reassignment noticed that many of their comrades would never return. The truth, 4 fleet carriers destroyed and hundreds of experienced aviators dead, slowly sank in. It was a loss the Japanese Navy could never truly recover from. The reason lay not just in the ships, but in the men. Japan's carrier air groups had been the most skilled in the world in 1941 and early 1942, the product of years of rigorous training and combat experience in China and the early Pacific campaigns. At Midway, many of those irreplaceable veterans were lost. In contrast, the United States could train new pilots and build new carriers at a pace Japan could not match. In 1943 alone, the United States would commission more than a dozen new fleet and escort carriers, while Japan could replace only a handful. Strategically, Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion. Before the battle, Tokyo's forces had advanced almost without interruption across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. After Midway, they would fight largely on the defensive. The initiative passed permanently to the United States. In the months that followed, the effects became clear. American forces launched a counteroffensive at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, an operation made possible only because the Japanese carrier threat had been blunted. The long, brutal struggle for that island chain would grind down the remainder of Japan's naval air arm. Every battle fought afterward, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, traced its origin to the turning of the tide at Midway. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory was not only a military success, but a triumph of intelligence, planning, and courage. The cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had cracked the enemy's plans. The decision to trust their work had allowed the Americans to prepare the ambush. The commanders at sea, Fletcher, Spruance, and their pilots, had seized the fleeting moment when fortune favored them. Above all, it was a victory of determination over fear. When Nimitz later wrote his after-action summary, he attributed success to 3 factors: courage, communication, and divine help. It was a fitting reflection of the uncertainty of war, how skill and luck often intertwine. By the end of June 1942, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The Japanese Navy, once supreme, now faced the grim task of defending a vast empire with dwindling resources. The United States, meanwhile, began to surge forward, fueled by industry and resolve. Shipyards along both coasts worked around the clock. New Essex-class carriers were launched almost monthly, each one larger and more powerful than its predecessors. Thousands of pilots, trained across the continental United States, preparing for the campaigns that would carry them all the way to the shores of Japan. Midway did not end the war, but it changed its direction irrevocably. From that point onward, every major operation, the island-hopping campaign, The recapture of the Philippines, and ultimately the road to victory in 1945, grew from the foundation laid in those critical June days. In the decades since the guns fell silent, the Battle of Midway has come to symbolize more than a military victory. It represents a moment when preparation, courage, and chance collided to alter the course of history. For the United States, it was proof that a nation wounded at Pearl Harbor could recover, adapt, and prevail against daunting odds. For Japan, it marked the beginning of a long retreat, a transition from rapid conquest to desperate defense. In purely military terms, Midway's significance was staggering. Four of Japan's premier fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed along with more than 250 aircraft and thousands of skilled personnel. These were not just ships, they were floating airfields whose crews represented years of training and experience. Losing them crippled Japan's ability to wage large-scale carrier warfare. After Midway, the Imperial Navy never again mounted a major offensive that relied on carrier power. By contrast, American losses, though painful, were limited. The Yorktown and one destroyer were sunk, and about 150 aircraft were lost. Yet for every plane or ship the Americans lost, replacements were already under construction. Industrial strength became the decisive factor. In the next 3 years, U.S. shipyards would launch dozens of carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and thousands of aircraft. The tide of production became a weapon in itself. Strategically, Midway halted Japanese expansion at its farthest reach. The islands that Japan had conquered in early 1942 formed a perimeter of power, stretching thousands of miles. But that perimeter was now fixed. From then on, it would shrink, island by island, under relentless American assault. The psychological effect was just as powerful. Until Midway, Japan's navy had been seen, even by many Americans, as invincible. Its aircraft, tactics, and discipline had dominated every battlefield. Midway shattered that image. It proved that the Japanese Navy could be surprised, outmaneuvered, and destroyed. The victory also validated a new form of naval warfare. For centuries, fleets had fought with battleships trading gunfire at close range. At Midway, the opposing fleets never saw each other directly. The carriers that decided the battle were separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. Air power, not gunnery, had become the decisive arm of naval combat. The lessons of Midway would guide naval strategy for the rest of the century. Among historians, debate has always surrounded the balance of luck and skill that shaped the battle. The American codebreaker's success, the chance sighting of the destroyer Arashi by McCluskey's group, and the precise timing of the dive bomber attack all seem almost miraculous in hindsight. Yet each stroke of fortune rested on disciplined preparation. Cryptanalysts working tirelessly, pilots training under pressure, commanders willing to take risks. As Admiral Nimitz later observed, the gods of war smiled upon us, but only because we prepared to meet them. For the men who fought at Midway, the experience left lasting scars. Survivors spoke of the eerie sight of burning carriers, the endless expanse of ocean, and the suddenness with which death could come from above. Many of the American aviators were in their early 20s, some barely out of flight school. Few had combat experience before the battle. By the end of it, they had written themselves into history. Among them were names that would become legendary in naval aviation. Wade McCluskey, Richard Best, Max Leslie, and Clarence McCluskey. Their courage and their luck became the stuff of textbooks and documentaries for generations to come. For the Japanese sailors who went down with their ships, Midway was a moment of tragic valor. Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to remain aboard Hiryu symbolized a devotion to duty that commanded respect even among his enemies. In later years, American officers who had fought at Midway often expressed admiration for their Japanese counterparts' discipline and bravery. The battle, fierce as it was, carried a mutual recognition of professionalism on both sides, a grim fraternity shared by those who face the same ocean and the same peril. In the modern era, Midway Atoll remains a quiet place. Its runways are still there, weathered by salt and wind, and the coral reefs around it teem with life. Occasionally, divers visit the underwater wrecks that lie scattered across the seabed, the silent hulks of ships that once carried the fate of nations. In their stillness lies a reminder of the immense cost of that victory. Every year, naval academies around the world study Midway, not just as a battle, but as a lesson in intelligence, leadership, and decision-making under pressure. It is a case study in how small choices, a delayed launch order, a misinterpreted signal, or a pilot's decision to search a few minutes longer, can change the course of history. The story of Midway endures precisely because it captures the unpredictability of war and the capacity of ordinary people to rise to extraordinary challenges. For the United States, the battle became a rallying symbol. Newspapers called it revenge for Pearl Harbor. Families who had mourned sons and husbands in December 1941 now had a reason to hope. The war in the Pacific was far from over. Thousands of miles of ocean and years of bloodshed still lay ahead. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. America had seized the initiative, and it would never let go. More than 80 years later, the echoes of those days still resonate. Midway stands as a testament to the power of resolve, the value of intelligence, and the courage of those who fought in the air and at sea. It reminds us that history often turns not on size or numbers, but on human decision, on leadership and a faith in the midst of uncertainty. When the smoke cleared in June 1942, the Pacific looked the same, endless water stretching to every horizon. Yet, everything had changed. The Empire of Japan, once unstoppable, had reached its high water mark. The United States, once reeling, had found its footing. The balance of the Pacific had shifted, and from that moment onward, the course of the Second World War bent inexorably toward Allied victory. If you did end up till the end, make sure to comment what should I cover next. I appreciate each one of you ladies and gents, and make sure to like and subscribe as more to come.